Hey church fam, you're listening to the Downtown Community Church podcast. Thank you for tuning in to this week's sermon. We're praying God would speak to you through it and you would see Christ-centered life change. Here's your pastor, Ben Kaempfer.
All right, well, we are in our second to last week in a series called Codependent Jesus, and if that sounds a bit heretical to you, good, it should, because the point of the whole series is to say that Jesus is not codependent, but we treat him like he is. I'm going to get into a little bit of what that means, but I want to say, number one is, like Grace said, if it's your first time here, super excited that you're here, and everybody, you're welcome to go participate in especially if you have kids, actually. You're welcome to go participate in trunk or treat afterwards. And man, it's just like, there's something about as you get older, you see like little kids dressed up. And I don't know why. I used to think my parents were like just wildly nerdy for seeing them, be like, that's cute. And now I'm like, dude, that is so cute, right? He's a little tiger, or you know what I mean? It's just like silly stuff. So I would invite everybody to come and join and be a part of that who you want to. In this series, Codependent Jesus, really, the arc of the entire series has been simple, and it takes a little bit of explanation of what codependence is, but I think it really kind of unlocks for us a spiritual concept that is pretty true. If you're not familiar with the idea of codependence, then let me introduce you to it for a second. In essence, it was this relational phenomenon that they tried to figure out, sociologists, therapists, mental health people, they try to figure out basically why is it that two people can be in a relationship with one another, one person continually giving to the point of the dismissal of self, while the other person continued to take to the dismissal of the other person as well. In other words, from the giver's perspective, I'm going to keep giving to the dismissal of me. And from the taker's perspective, I'm going to keep taking to the dismissal of you. And the spiritual overlay of that is simply to say this, that we do the same thing with Jesus. We do the same thing with Jesus. We do it in a little bit more of a sophisticated way, and I think a little bit more of a covert way. But the reason we're looking at it through this lens is because we have a tendency to do something like this. When I'm in financial need, I'm praying, God, would you show up? God, would you move? Would you do something? Would you provide in such a way? And God, we know that you are all things. We know that, God, you own all things. We, God, know that you are all powerful. So can you help me to pay my light bill? Because Daddy needs a job right now where nobody in this household is eating, right? And so we invite him in that moment. Let me tell you, there is nothing wrong with that prayer. Because when you're in that moment, in that financial stress especially, I think there's no pressure or no stress like financial stress. And when you're in that moment, right, there's this something inside of you deep that just longs for the presence of God to be there. And then when it is there, when all of a sudden we do have what we need, when we do know where the next paycheck is coming from, and there's a high sense of stability and consistency, then all of a sudden we want to exclude God from the financial component of our life. And we do this in a ton of different areas. We pray when we need God. When we have all we need, we try to pretend like we no longer need God. In other words, we care more about what he gives us than the one giving it to us. We want to lean in our relationship when we need something, but we don't necessarily want to lean into the relationship with God when it seems like we have everything that we need. If anything, at times, we push back because what we also know is that God can be particularly disruptive in our lives. So at times, it's just easier to push away when we have what we need. And so this series has been kind of going and parsing out different pieces and places and components. And next week, I'm just going to let you know, we're going to turn the whole series on its head, and it's going to be a fun way to kind of end the whole thing. And so I was thinking, man, what do we need to talk about this week? Because we've been talking about in and out of like kind of macro level principles, individual specific ones, whether it was kind of the context or the concepts or whether it was money or purpose. And so this week I was thinking, man, there are so many things that I think fall into this category. I just want to talk about the umbrella of this category. I want to talk about what I think at the root of it all is the father of all of our places of spiritual codependency as the taker, and treating God as if he's the codependent giver, which is, again, problematically, he's not. So then we become disappointed and upset. Spiritual frustration, sometimes leaving God, sometimes leaving a relationship with God because he didn't do what we thought he should do. Little did we realize we just had a sense of codependency around it. The father of all this, by the way, let me just tell you what that is. It's a lack of contentment. It's a lack of satisfaction, dissatisfaction. Let me say it this way. It's a little bit more poetic. The roots of spiritual codependency are grounded in the soil of a lack of contentment. The roots of codependency are grounded in the soil of dissatisfaction. That in essence, think about this, the reason why we take is because we feel like we need something. What if we didn't feel like we needed anything? What if you felt content? What if I felt content? What if we felt content? Well, what's interesting is that Jesus actually has this really fascinating interaction with a lady as he's traveling through a particular place where he normally wouldn't walk through. And in it, he brings up some stuff that I'm telling you, if you have read this story, you've probably read this story and thought, wow, that was wildly insensitive of Jesus. And you're right, it was, but he had a purpose behind it, or maybe it wasn't. We'll see in a second. But what's interesting about it is Jesus actually talks to this thing, talks to this issue, talks to this kind of core existential problem that I think that we all feel, basically said this way. Every single one of us wakes up driven, longing for something. Jesus' simple question is this: what is it? The book of John, chapter 1, talks about Jesus. John chapter 4, verse 1, now when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that he was making and baptizing more disciples than John, that's John the Baptist, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee. And when he had had to pass through Samaria, so he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar. Now, this is one of those things in the Bible where it's like, man, this is, why in the world are we just going through a lot of this happened and that happened, so he walked from this place to that place. So here's why. There was a huge historical level of tension between Jews and Samaritans. In essence, if you've taken Old Testament class, then you've probably heard about this, or you just kind of, study the Bible a good amount, you've probably heard about this. But nation of Israel was kind of God's chosen people back in the day. The nation of Israel was split into two kingdoms, northern kingdom, southern kingdom. The nation of Assyria went and invaded the northern kingdom, and as they invaded the northern kingdom, they basically took everybody of significance and value. They exported them everywhere. They took other people from other places and imported them into their cities, into their spaces and places. And what happened is they began to intermarry, worship false gods, and all of a sudden they became kind of this rogue version of Judaism. And so the people who at this point consider themselves Jews, not Samaritans, there was this historical level of tension that existed. So much so that if you were going from the place that Jesus was going to the places that Jesus was going, oftentimes you would walk around Samaria. That's like saying, if you're going from Florida to Tennessee, you're going to walk around Georgia, right? No, it sounds like, oh, they're just going to walk around and like we're in like a living room. Like, no. This was like massive in terms of like the level of inconvenience. And so Jesus intentionally walks to this place of darkness, or this place of tension at least. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. It's a really historical well, a lot of cool things we could pull out of this, but we're going to kind of just acknowledge the fact that this is a significant place, a substantive place. Jacob's well was there, so Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well, and it was about the 6th hour. The relevance of that is so it was 6 a.m.? No, it was like the 6th hour of day since sunlight came up, so it was hot outside. And a woman from Samaria came to draw water. So Jesus is just sitting on this well, chilling on this well. Some people say he was sitting on top of the well. And so Jesus said to her, he says this, he says, give me a drink. Now, it's really easy to contextualize this into some weird ways, but part of it's like, Jesus, you didn't like say please. I don't know if Mary, your mama, ever told you. You always say please. But here's what was interesting, and here's what you need to know kind of about the actual thing that's happening here. So number one would be to say this, that Jews and Samaritans didn't talk. They didn't interface. They walked around, as we previously said. The other part that's interesting about this is that not every, but for many of the rabbis, there was such a level of the rabbis' differentness, set apartness, whatever it was, that actually rabbis in their culture often wouldn't even talk to women in public, even their wife. Now, I don't know about your marriage, but that would not go well with mine. Walking outside, we're trunk or treating, and it's like, Lindsay walks up and she says, hey, and I'm like, what's up? Just walking by. We'd have some problems. Now, what's interesting about this is he not only talks to a woman who's not his wife, he talks to a woman who's also a Samaritan. Now, here's why I just bring that up, because a lot of people are just like, oh, here's cool context. No, here's why I think that's important. Because there's some of us that feel like we are so categorically different from Jesus, he could never actually talk to us. He could never actually speak to us. He would never actually walk in the places and spaces where we are. But the message to begin this morning is to say simply this, is that Jesus sometimes walks into those places and spaces intentionally just to have a conversation. And so if you feel like you're far from God, you're unreachable by God, that you are categorically so different that you could never be accessed by God, then I want you to know the good news is this is who Jesus is talking to you. He is talking to you specifically, categorically in this text. So he says, give me a drink. Oh, here's the other weird part about that. He didn't have a cup. And so basically what he's also saying is not just like, give me a drink, provide for me some water. He's saying, let me drink from your water bottle. Now, they didn't have COVID at that point in time, so that was a little more acceptable, right? But not really, right? Like, I want you to imagine, like, he doesn't know this person, as I think Japhon Layson says, he doesn't know her from Adam's house cat, right? And so, or she doesn't know him at least. And so she's walking up, she sees this dude on the well, and he's like, yo, let me get a drink of your water bottle. I'm like, bro, no, that's, boundaries. I don't know if you've heard of that or not. And she says to him, how is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? Parentheses, just in case we didn't know, for Jews have no dealings with Samaritan. So she's saying, how is it that you are even talking to me, let alone asking me for a drink? And this is what Jesus answers her. Now, I want you to imagine, you think you're having a normal conversation with a person sitting on a well who just asked you for a drink. And all of a sudden, he spouts off some existential, ideological, theological. You're like, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. Bro, I was just trying to get some water this morning, right? Like, wait, what are we talking about right now? You asked me, I said, why are you talking to me? And you said, if you had realized who I was talking to, then you would have asked, somebody would have asked somebody, I would have living water, what? And Jesus says to her, without clarifying, she says, the woman said to him, Jesus, sir, you have nothing to draw water with. I don't know if you know this big guy, but you ain't even got a bucket. And the well is deep. And where do you get living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us this well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock. Some people, when you read the Bible, by the way, there's a lot of times where we just feel like a genuine, earnest, like, oh, are you greater than our father Jacob? I'm pretty sure this was sarcastic. She's like, bro, you think you're better than Jacob? He literally gave us this well and drank it from ourselves. And you're talking about you can give water better than him? Jesus said to her, without, again, clarifying, everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. He said, once you want to know about the water that you're drinking, you're just going to continue to be thirsty. Yeah, Jesus, that's kind of how water works. That's how the human body works. We drink, we get dehydrated, we drink more water. He says, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. He says, here's what I want you to know, that the water that I'm going to give you is not only going to quench your thirst, it is going to completely and fully be something inside of you that not only makes you not thirsty, but it actually makes you a spring. So the woman said to him, sir, give me this water. In other words, dibs, right? She's like, that sounds phenomenal. I'm in. She thinks they're talking about her life. So that I will not be thirsty. You have to come here to draw water. No, Jesus, this is the 6th hour of the day. I mean, come on, John wrote it. We all know this, right? It's hot outside. I would love to not have to make this track. She's thinking the physical. This is kind of like when Nicodemus came to Jesus. Nicodemus, who came at nighttime, Nick at night, for everybody over 35. Nicodemus came at nighttime. Jesus said, in order, to eternal life, all this kind of stuff, you must be born again. And Nicodemus is like, what? Jesus, I don't know if you took 8th grade health class. That's pretty impossible. So Jesus is actually using this idea of thirst to say, hey, we all thirst for something. What is the thing that you're thirsting for? And where are you looking to satiate that thirst? Well, so the next thing that Jesus says is so offensive. It seems so honestly insensitive. And this lady's walking up. She didn't ask for any of this. He just said, can I have a drink? She said, why are you talking to me? And all of a sudden, living water, flows of living water, bubbling up, a brook, a well of spring, and all this kind of stuff. And she's like, okay, I'm in. And then he says something wildly insensitive. This is what he says. Jesus said to her, go call your husband and come here. Now, this wasn't like a patriarchy type of a thing. He's using this as an access point because she says to him, I have no husband. He says, go, call your husband here. The woman answered him, I have no husband. Miss Independent, right? He says, you're right in saying I have no husband. But that's not the whole truth. You're right in saying I have no husband. For you have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true. Now this is in the moment. This is wild. I mean, you got to imagine this. She's sitting there thinking, what? Like, we were just talking about water, and now we're bringing up my love life? Here's what I think is really fascinating about this. Because you read this, and it's like, man, Jesus, that is very invasive. It seems, it seems like a full left turn in the conversation. Now, Jesus is talking about a spiritual reality. And she thinks we're still talking about this physical reality. And the spiritual reality has a physical manifestation, but it's not physical at its core, it's spiritual at its core. And what I think is really fascinating about the rest of the story is Jesus never brings this back up. She never brings this back. He never brings this back up. He never says, now let's bring back up the 5 husband thing. Let's talk about that again. And he kind of moves on from that. And here's why I think he does that. He doesn't make her feel this overwhelming and bring it back up and rub in this guilt, rub in this shame, rub in this you're awful, rub in this you've done horrible things. Oh my gosh, how could you? But here's what he does. He brings up her husbands to let her know of the internal thirst that she doesn't even know exists. There's something inside of her that's longing for something. There's something inside of her that's saying, man, if I could just have that, if I could just acquire that, if I could just feel satisfied. And we don't know what it was for her. But 5 husbands in our day, it's a pretty high number, right? Maybe that's your story and you're praying for you, God bless you, a bunch of stuff, right? But in their day, that was wild. And he looks and says, basically, hey, let's talk about this. Not because I want you to feel bad, but here's what I want you to do. I want you to see that the places in the wells that you're currently going to, the wells that you're going to right now, they're not satisfying your thirst. Here's what I love about what Jesus does. Let me tell you what that means in principle. Before Jesus continues to answer questions about who he is and how he satisfies, he basically says, before I answer more questions, let me first question your answers. Let me first ask a question. What is satisfying you right now? What is that well that you're going to? What is that place, that thing, that space that you feel like internally is the deep desires and longing of your heart that if you can finally get, if you can finally have, then finally you will be satisfied. You will be okay. You will be content. I will be content. We will be content. So he looks at her and he says, okay, let's, I know that you're still thinking about, we're talking about just like regular water, but I'm talking about this spiritual water. I'm talking about the fact that when I come into your life in such a way that there's this overwhelming response that I love you, you love me too, in such a way that the Spirit of God is inside of you and it brings you this contentment because Jesus finds you valuable and worthy above all else. But hey, before we get there, how's the current trajectory going? One thing that's interesting is we all have a well. And some of us, we just have a lot of wells. For some of us, it is that well. It's the well of relationship. And that's so difficult because there's so much of the intimacy, of the companionship, of the transparency, vulnerability that mirrors our relationship with God. I feel valued and worth because someone else finds me valuable and worthy. Especially, I've heard it said this way, above all else of the things that we desire, it's the praise of those that we find praiseworthy. Maybe that's you. Honestly, for me, I was thinking, man, what is it for me? I'm like, what is it? Which of all of them are they? For some of you, it's man, you're driven by success and productivity. And Jesus says, well, which business is going to satisfy you? And you're like, well, I don't have a business. He's like, you're right. You started and sold 3 businesses already, and you're looking for 4, 5, and 6. And let me just tell you, 4, 5, and 6 aren't going to make you any more happy than 1, 2, or 3 did. I know you got kids. You thought they were going to satisfy you, and man, they did when they were like small, but then you didn't really get much sleep. But then you look back and you kind of forget that not much sleep, because then they go through some 3 terrible 3s, and that is terrible. And then they there's a little sweet spot in elementary school at times, not always, right? And then they get to middle school, and it's like, oh, Satan is real. You know how it is. You're middle school right now, maybe, and there's things like your parents, and you're kind of becoming more aware of what's around you and the people around you and the world around you, and your parents love you and they care for you, but you don't really want to snuggle with them like you used to, and you used to be like, oh, my baby, and now you're like, Mom, stop. Or, Dad, stop. Or, hey, maybe you're like, Dad, can we hang out? It's a little too deep, I'm sorry. Maybe for you, it's a level of comfort. It is the success, it is the productivity, and maybe it's like in our mind, the things that gets us going, and it's our popularity, it's how people like us, and it's like, Jesus is saying, okay, you're right, you don't have 1,000 followers, you have 10,000 followers, and now you're not nearly as happy as you were when you had 1,000 followers, because now what you're actually finding out is that you have 10,000 followers, and you're still not happy, and you think maybe I can get 20,000 followers, then I'll finally be happy. And you're not. And let me say this. All of us have that. And the point of bringing those up is not to say, and you are an awful person. We are awful people, to be clear. But that's kind of self-evident. It's to say that there's a well that's better. It's to say that there's a well that actually we can spend our entire lives going for, looking for, trying to satiate, quench that thirst in. And all of a sudden we come to the realization that there is no well that seems like it fully and finally quenches and satisfies that thirst, that internal longing, that internal desire. And Jesus isn't bringing it up this morning. I'm not bringing it up this morning because I'm like, man, I can't wait to make every single person who walks in this building feel terrible about themselves and the idolatry that exists in our heart and our lives. But it's simply to say this. Maybe our Father just loves us enough to say there's a better well. And not only will you not be thirsty, but you will become the provision of water to people around you. The woman said to him, Sir, I perceive you're a prophet. So perceptive. Shocking. I think right now in this moment she's a little bit uncomfortable, as I probably would be too. I mean, you're like the Savior of the world looking at you being like, what's your well? Like, you think it's bad with me? Imagine just you and Jesus one-on-one. She says, our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. Now, she's probably feeling uncomfortable and wants to kind of distance the conversation. Like, oh, you're a prophet. Let me ask you a question, prophet. Let me ask you a question about worship. Where should we worship? Should it be this place or that place? And again, I mean, I can tell you how many times I read through this, and I'm like, this just seems so, like, why did Jesus go on this rabbit trail and actually answer the question about worship? And the reason I think he's actually answering the question about worship and why he brought up the husband is because he's been talking about worship the entire time. Another way to say that the thing that we long for, that thing that we desire for, the thing that our life revolves around, that thing that really deep internal longing, desire for something, that thing that something is that we look for, that we long for, that we push for, that we dream of, that we work for, that's what we worship. That's the thing that we worship. And it's almost like Jesus is like, hey, I'm glad you brought up worship because that's what I've actually been talking about the entire time. And so let me tell you a little bit about worship and what this looks like. He says, woman, believe me, the hour is coming. The hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers, in other words, the people who really get this, the people whose lives are really centered around, will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, with the conceptual at the level of desire, and it will make its way out into the level of pragmatic. I worship in spirit, and my heart, my desires, my functions, my affections go for and towards God, and those influence how I actually live. It's both how I feel and what I do. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit, in truth. In other words, he's saying God is the one who wants. God is the one who desires your worship. And by the way, the worship of God, God central, everything revolving around him. That's the only well. That's the spring. She asked, where do I find it? He's saying, this is how you find it. You worship me. Love me, serve me. But what I love about God is this, is he didn't just say that in a sense of like ego and I'm God, I'm set apart, I deserve to be worshiped. Though he does, and he could, and he'd be fully justified if he did. What he actually says is this: because of our sinfulness, or the understanding of what we know in the gospel is this, because of our sinfulness, we are alienated from God. God is holy, he's pure, he's perfect, he's just. He is all of those things. And what we know is that God cannot have sin in his presence. Problematically, we have all sinned. And I can be better, but my better is always subjective to you, not objective to the reality of the purity, of the love of who God is. So God saw that. God knew that. God saw that we ran after every other well but him and said, I want to do something to not only show that I am a well, I am the well, I am the one that you go to, but I actually want to do something for you so that you can actually drink from this well, because his well is far too holy for us and we are categorically incompatible. And so God provided a way through Jesus to not only say this is the only well worth giving your life for, but I also want you to give your life for this well in response to the fact that he gave it for you and for me. Well, she says back to him, I know that Messiah is coming. He who is called Christ. Messiah is the Hebrew word for the Greek word Christ. It's not just Jesus' last name, contrary to popular belief. When he comes, he will tell us all things. I love that. She's like, yeah, I know this isn't it. But you know what? Someday it's going to make sense. Someday there's going to be someone. Someday it's going to happen. Someday it's going to come. And Jesus is just looking at her saying, he says this words, I who speak to you am he. In other words, I know that you're looking, I know that you're wanting, I know that you're longing, I know that deep down you know that what you're doing is not satisfying you. And here you are looking at satisfaction in the face, looking at the overflow in the face, looking at the spring of living water in the face. And I'm telling you that I am he. In fact, he isn't even in the actual Greek translation of this. It just says, I who speak to you, or I who speak, I am. In other words, this was a pull from Moses. This was a pull from the burning bush. This was a pull from massive God of the Old Testament where they couldn't even speak his name because he was so holy. And he's saying, that one that you're waiting for, that one that you're looking for, that one that you're longing for, it's me. I don't know what you walked in this morning with. I don't know what you thought. I don't know what your longings were, what your desires were, what your thoughts were, what your relational pattern, what your financial pattern, what your productivity pattern, what your business acumen. I don't know what your real estate is. I don't know what your 401k is. I don't know what your follower count is. I don't know the level that people look at you or don't look at you. But here's what I do know. From somebody who has tried a lot of different ways. If you can learn from my experience, know that as I look at my life, and God has given me some abilities and capabilities and to do some neat stuff and meet some cool people, let me tell you, it is so meaningless without Jesus. Because none of those things were ever meant to satisfy our hearts, satisfy our longings, and satisfy our desires. I'm going to read this quote. It's something that I've said dozens of times as we're gathered together, but I just wanted to read this because C.S. Lewis just says some stuff that I think that's it. It says, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exist. A baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. Here's the invitation. It's to come to Jesus this morning and to say, Jesus, I give you everything. And to be honest, he is the well that overflows, but he is the well that I have to look to every day to continually satisfy. Because the things of this world, man, it's just so easy to get pulled away. It's just so easy to think that's what matters and that's what I care about. And man, about this and that's how I feel. And if only this or if only that or if that situation. But to look and say, Jesus, you are the only thing that satisfies me internally, deeply. And all this other stuff, it's beautiful. But to have any of that stuff to the exclusion of you, to have any of that stuff as the central place of the water that I'm drinking from, it will only leave me longing for more. You see, the spiritual roots of our codependence is in the soil of our lack of satisfaction. And it's because our lack of satisfaction of the soil can often be everything but Jesus. So here's the invitation. I don't know what well you're running to right now. I don't know which one you continually draw from. But the opportunity is to repent and to say, Jesus, I know that well won't satisfy, and you are the only one who will. Thank you for dying on the cross for me. Thank you that you've given your life for me. And Jesus, maybe I've given my life to you. Maybe Jesus, it's just a moment that I need to come back to you, and I need to continue to come back to you. And every day this week, Jesus, just help me to come back to you, the only well that doesn't run dry. So if that's you, and you're someone in here who you've given your life to Jesus or you want to, the way that we're going to end this service together is this. We're going to take communion as a church family, to celebrate the God who gave everything for us, to celebrate the river, to celebrate the well, to celebrate the living water that gave himself up for us. On the last night, he got his closest followers together. He said, this is my body which was broken. This is my blood that was shed. So often as you do this, so often as you eat this meal, do this and remember me. Remember the blood that was shed. Remember my body was broken. And I want you to know it's because I love you. It's because I deeply care about you. It's because I passionately pursue you. It's because I care enough to say uncomfortable things that maybe go through the boundaries of the places that you want to allow me. But it's because I don't want you to spend the rest of your life running after wells that will continually make you more thirsty. So in a second, the band's going to come back up. And we're going to take communion together to say, Jesus, thank you for loving me. And I give everything back to you. Help me to look for you, the only well that won't run dry. I'm praying the love of God invades in such a way that you feel such a level of satisfaction, of love, that it wells up inside of you. And you'll realize that nothing can touch this, because nothing on this planet was made to. Let's pray. God, thank you. Thank you for the fact that you love us and that you care for us and that you love us enough to say things that in the moment just feel really uncomfortable. But God, your heart and your desire is not for our shame. It's for our freedom. That we would be free to no longer run to the wells that were never meant to satisfy us, but Jesus, that we would be free to run to you, to run after you, to spend our days not just trying to be satisfied, but that we would be so satisfied in you, King Jesus, that we would overflow as living water onto the people around us, that the people around us, whether or not they believe in you, would experience you because of the way that you move in us and through us. So God, during this next song, would you just simply help us to experience your love and your grace? Because once we taste that water, though at times we wander and at times we dabble in other wells, God, at the end of the day, once we taste that water, we will know that there is no other water that actually satisfies. So Jesus, can you help us? The best that we can this side of heaven to experience your overwhelming love for us as we take communion together. And would you help us? Would you help that to be a starting point? That daily we begin to run to you, the living water, the well that won't run dry, the Messiah and the great I am, Jesus.